Without doubt, some of the most stunning and famous photos ever taken came from the Apollo missions, and without them, they wouldn't have had the same public support or iconic stature that they have today, and nearly all of them were taken by one make and model of camera. But those pictures weren't a guaranteed thing. Even Earthrise, taken by Apollo 8, was a lucky fluke of being in the right place at the right time with the right equipment. And on Apollo 11, there is only one moderately average high-res photo of the first man on the moon, Neil Armstrong, actually outside on the moon. In the beginning, NASA was much more focused on the science and didn't really see the need to photograph the journey, so to speak, unless it had a very real scientific benefit. But the photos taken early on the Mercury missions by John Glenn with a $40 drugstore automatic camera proved that they did have a worth beyond that of the purely scientific. So when NASA started using the Hasselblad 500C on the suggestion of one of its astronauts, the world got to see space, the moon and the Earth in a much better way that is instantly recognisable today. This is how one camera gave us those shots and changed the world we see. A big thanks go out to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Now, whilst working on today's subject, I came across something that I never really thought about, and that was when Zeiss were making the world's fastest planar 50mm f/0.7 lens for NASA to photograph the far side of the moon in 1966. There was a huge amount of maths involved to work out the shapes of the complex lenses inside, and that was all done by hand and very slow, until IBM stepped in and offered the use of a mainframe to speed up the process. Now, you may not be making a record-breaking optical lens, but there are many instances where you might need to study something maybe more down to earth, like how much energy you're using to combat your high bills, and how much you could save by changing from, say, gas to electric and using a heat pump. Well, Brilliant is an interactive problem-solving website and app where you learn by doing, breaking down problems into easily understandable, bite-sized pieces before putting them back together to show the result. Brilliant has a new course to help you out called Introduction to Algebra. Yes, that's stuff you learnt at school and never thought you'd ever use again and forgot all about. Now, this deals with algebraic expressions, equations, graphs, rates, and a lot more, all in an easily understandable format so you can tackle maths problems that you want to know and deal with but don't know how to go about doing. You can learn maths, science, computer science from basic to advanced, all at your own pace and in your own time. Get started now for free, and the first 200 people will get 20% off of the annual premium subscription if you use the link shown here and in the description below. When John Glenn bought a $40 Ansco AutoSet camera from his local drugstore in Florida in 1962, little did he know that he would start a trend that would lead to arguably the most famous pictures ever being taken and many more afterwards. Glenn was about to become the first American to orbit the Earth aboard the Friendship 7 mission on February 20th, 1962, and for whatever reason, maybe to bypass the time-consuming bureaucracy of procurement, he wanted to take his own handheld camera to record the journey. His was not the only stills camera on board. NASA had another Leica camera fitted with a quartz lens and a prism to take spectroscopic images of the stars. As they were well above the limitations of the atmosphere, these would be able to capture the full spectrum well into the ultraviolet range. But that would not take pictures of what Glenn saw outside of the window of his Mercury capsule. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing. Glenn couldn't just smuggle it on board in his back pocket. It had to go through NASA because they modified it for him by turning the camera upside down and adding a pistol grip, modified film advance lever and shutter paddle so it could be operated with Glenn's left hand, and added a new viewfinder on the bottom of the camera, which was now the top, so he could use it even with his visor down if required. Whilst the images he took were good, the limitations of the $40 camera were apparent. And by the summer of 1962, when Walter Schirra, the fifth American in space, was getting ready, he wanted to up the quality. Shearer, who was an amateur photographer, asked photographers from Life and National Geographic which would be the best camera, and they told him to get hold of a Hasselblad 500C, a $500 high-end Swedish import that used 60 by 60mm film format, almost 4 times that of the size of a 35mm in Glen's Ansco. That would give a much higher resolution image, had interchangeable Carl Zeiss lenses, and removable film magazine. Now, this is a completely manual, non-automatic compared to the Ansco, but was of much higher quality, but it still required modifying to make it usable in space and astronaut-proof. The NASA engineers lightened it by removing the leather covering, the reflex mirror, auxiliary shutter, and changed the waist viewfinder for a custom side-mounted one because they couldn't look down at it with the spacesuit and helmet on in the tight space of the Mercury capsule. They also removed the film release button so it couldn't accidentally be knocked whilst floating around in the spacecraft, and painted it black to remove the reflections from the window of the capsule. The film magazine was also remade to hold a commercial 70mm cartridge with 18 feet of film, permitting up to 70 exposures instead of the usual 12. Whilst Shearer's first flight aboard Mercury Sigma 7 was on October 3, 1962, and was 9 hours long and involved lots of technical evaluation, part of the mission was to take 2 sets of photos of the Earth with the Hasselblad, one of which would use a set of coloured filters in front of the lens to help calibrate the spectral reflectivity of clouds and surface features for future weather satellites. Whilst there were a few bogged exposures, the good ones showed that the quality was much better than before. But it would be the Gemini 4 mission when Ed White became the first American to perform a spacewalk, which was captured by Commander James McDivitt using a Hasselblad that caught the public's imagination and showed the power of these high-quality photos had, as they were shown around the world on the front pages of newspapers and magazines. Both Mercury and Gemini were the build-up to Apollo, and this is where the Hasselblad would truly shine and give us the photos that would go down in history as the culmination of the first space race, and for the first time show us our place in space. It wasn't until Ed White's spacewalk photos went worldwide that Hasselblad found out themselves by studying the images that NASA were using their cameras. So they got in touch with NASA to see if they could help in any way, which of course they could. Many of the modifications that NASA did became standard features in the new cameras as time went by, making them even more suitable for use in space straight from the factory. This also encouraged the photographic filmmakers like Kodak to expand the development of a thin polyester base on which the conventional colour emulsions were applied. This thin film and the elimination of the cartridge allowed up to 42 feet of film and 160 colour exposures and 200 black and white exposures per magazine. An electric drive was also added to wind the film on and remove the hand crank, which made them easier to use. These became known as the 500EL and used either Carl Zeiss planar f2.8 80mm lenses or Zeiss Sonar f5.6 250mm telephoto lenses, and were first used on the Apollo 8 mission. Although the Hasselblads were primarily handheld single cameras, they were used for other purposes, in particular the 4-camera cluster for multispectral photography. Here, 4 Hasselblads were used together, 3 of which used black and white film with different colour filters in front of 3 of them, and a 4th with colour film to act as a control image. On Apollo 8, a 500EL with an 80mm lens was fixed to the left rendezvous window of the command module and used a timer to take images at regular intervals to document the docking procedures and the moon's surface. As they orbited the Earth would rise above the surface, but on the first 3 orbits this went unseen by the crew. On the 4th orbit, the crew were performing a rotation of the command module, with the fixed camera looking down at the surface and taking images every 20 seconds. As they did this, the Earth was rising above the surface and was visible from a side window by Bill Anders, who took a shot with the Hasselblad fitted with a 250mm telephoto lens, but it had a black and white magazine attached. Anders quickly asked Jim Lovell to pass him the colour magazine, during which time the Earth moved out of view from his window but reappeared in the hatch window. Anders quickly took a couple of colour shots, the first one of which became known as Earthrise, and went on to feature on the cover of Time magazine and become the poster shot for the environmental movement, and showed the Earth as it had never been seen before, as the blue marble in the blackness of space above the monochromatic lunar surface, the only colour in the universe, as Anders called it. The image was not planned and happened purely by chance, but again proved the value of taking high-res images during the mission as and when the moment occurred. Apollo 11 was the mission where the photos would become some of the most influential ever taken, so everything had to go right. But the Hasselblads had never been used in the vacuum of space, where the temperature on the lunar surface could go between 120 degrees C in the sun and minus 65 degrees C in the shade. To cope with this, they made a version of the 500 EL called the data camera, which would be worn by the astronauts when on the surface. This had a matte silver coating to reflect the sun's heat and try and maintain a more even temperature inside. A reso plate was also installed, which was made from glass and was fitted to the back of the camera extremely close to the film. These plates had very fine crosses engraved onto them in the form of a precise grid, which would be exposed onto the images to provide a means of determining the angular distances between objects in the field of view, because there were no known landmarks or known sizes on the lunar surface. Each of the plates also had the last two numbers of the camera's serial number engraved onto it, so the camera and the person who took the image could be identified later. Sometimes you can just see them if the images haven't been cropped at the center bottom of the frame. A new Zeiss lens, the Biogon f5.660, was also made specifically for NASA. To ensure the highest quality, lowest distortion images, each one was calibrated to its own camera. The data cameras were also modified to prevent the buildup of static electricity on the film, as it was wound on over the reso plate in the camera, something which would not normally be an issue with the humidity of the air on the Earth. However, in the vacuum of space, this could build up and cause sparks that would affect the image and possibly even start a fire in the very high oxygen content of the atmosphere of the lander, something which had been learnt from the Apollo 1 fire. New lubricant also had to be developed because the normal grease that would be used would evaporate away in the vacuum and the wide temperature swings. Once Apollo 11 was on the surface, Armstrong and Aldrin were told to take lots of images from the inside before they left the lander, just in case the data cameras failed in the vacuum. The data cameras were fitted to a bracket on the chest of the astronaut's suit, which meant they couldn't look down at the camera. The crew had to be trained how to take pictures by pointing their upper body at the object. As the cameras didn't have light metering, the astronauts would set the exposure to 1/250th of a second and the f-stop for 5.6 for objects in the shade and f11 for those in the sun. If it was an important shot, they would use exposure bracketing, varying the exposures one stop up or down from the recommended setting to ensure a good result. Although there were 2 data cameras with colour film taken on the lander, only Neil Armstrong wore his, as Buzz Aldrin was busy setting up the experiments, which they had to complete in just 2.5 hours. They did briefly swap, but this led to a bit of an embarrassing situation for NASA when they were back on Earth and the world's media were clamouring for high-quality images from the moon's surface. No one could find a photo of the first man to step foot on the moon, Armstrong, on the moon. Eventually, they did find one taken by Aldrin, but it was of Armstrong standing in the shade of the lander with his back to the camera, which is why all the shots with the data camera from the surface are of Buzz Aldrin. Apparently Buzz was just too busy and the camera wasn't part of the job to think about taking photos, something which was rectified on later missions. Once the magazines had been used up, they were fixed to a tether by Armstrong and hoisted up by Aldrin into the lander, and then an unused magazine was lowered back down to Armstrong on the surface. The magazine, which had the shots taken from the surface, were marked as the S magazines, and these were the most important ones. Once the surface mission was over, they took the magazines and left the cameras behind to save weight. Back on Earth, the films were developed using a special technique which decontaminated them in order in which they were taken. This was to make sure that there were no errors in the cleaning chemicals, which would eventually be used for the later S magazines, which contained by then the most valuable film in the world. However, it was during the process of handling the S magazine that Terry Slezak, a photolab technician, became the first human on Earth to become contaminated with lunar soil from a magazine that had been dropped on the surface by Armstrong when he picked it out of a protective bag without wearing gloves, although they were working in a bio-sealed room. Armstrong had left a note in the bag saying that it had been dropped and was very important and contained exposures from the surface. Slezak said afterwards that he'd been working on the magazines with his team for almost 24 hours straight because of the demand for the photos and was very tired. He picked up the bag, opened it and just pulled out the magazine and then noticed it was covered in a dark, sparkly soot that felt very abrasive. Someone then asked him what that was and he said, "It's moon dust because that's where it's just come from." At that point, everybody else left the room and he had to be stripped and decontaminated, but was none the worse for his handling of the dust afterwards. The Apollo 11 mission carried 4 70mm Hasselblad cameras and returned with 9 magazines of film. They took 1,409 exposures during the mission, with 1,408 usable images, 857 on black and white film and 551 on colour, and an additional 35 exposures were made with the Apollo lunar surface close-up camera as stereo exposures of the lunar soil. The photos made the astronauts and the mission go down in history, and it also boosted the reputation of a small Swedish camera maker to similar astronomical heights, from which they never looked back. And you can still find classic Hasselblad 500Cs and EL cameras on the second-hand market should you want to use a camera that photographed all of the moon missions up until Apollo 17. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, then please thumbs up, share and subscribe, and as usual, a big thanks go out to all of our Patreons for their ongoing support.